So this is going to be the first of many episodes about the intimate relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Steve Bannon. The Steve Bannon that has had the ear of Donald Trump for I don't know how long. The Steve Bannon that was one of the critical parts of the attempts to steal the election in 2020 from the voters. The Steve Bannon who was all over the Epstein files. And yet, not a single member, Republican, I have to say, of House Oversight, House Judiciary, the Senate, whatever, they have not been trying to sit down to speak to Steve Bannon. Now, you may say, accurately so, Steve Bannon would never comply with a congressional subpoena, and you're fucking right. How do we know? Well, remember, he went to a trial, was found guilty, and went to prison for defying a congressional subpoena that was served on him by the House Select Committee that was investigating January 6, 2021, and Bannon's critical role in planning that insurrection. And, of course, it is obvious to those that have a brain that the reason why Steve Bannon continues to be insulated in this particular Trump administration and Trump DOJ, despite his close, intimate ties with Jeffrey Epstein, is because he's Steve Bannon. And not only does he have the dirt and knows about where all the bodies are buried and the skeletons in the closets, plural, for all of the people, not only for Trump, but in Trump's orbit, but Bannon also knows what Jeffrey Epstein knew about Trump, the Epstein elite, and hundreds, I am sure, if not more, of global leaders, titans of industry, power brokers, newsmakers, right? People that had money, means, and influence. Bannon knows what Jeffrey Epstein knew. So interestingly, I submit to you, Steve Bannon's more valuable than Ghislaine Maxwell ever will be. Because Steve Bannon has held close those secrets. And how do we know that Steve Bannon also knows a lot about what Jeffrey Epstein knew and what Jeffrey Epstein was doing? Is because Steve Bannon is sitting on hours of footage that he filmed about Jeffrey Epstein in an attempt to produce a film/documentary of and about Jeffrey Epstein in an effort to pretty much redeem Jeffrey Epstein's image. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And again, this will be one of several episodes about Steve Bannon. We're going to focus on a particular angle of Bannon right now, which is that film. But part of the reason why Bannon is in the headlines today, February 10th, 2026, is because of the following. The Justice Department in the Trump administration, headed up by law lackey Pamela Jo Bondi, is now taking steps to throw out Steve Bannon's conviction after being prosecuted by the DOJ for failing to comply with a congressional subpoena. In Monday, just yesterday, the DOJ filed a motion basically saying, we want the Supreme Court of the United States to take his case, as in Steve Bannon's case, we want to have it sent back to the district court where the U.S. attorney for D.C., Jeanine Pirro, box of wine Pirro, she did a 2-page filing yesterday as well, where she told the federal judge, who's a Trump appointee, a guy by the name of Judge Carl Nichols, that he should dismiss Steve Bannon's indictment, quote, in the interests of justice. Now, mind you, Jeanine Pirro, box of wine, was the only attorney who signed that filing. A big tell, as we know. Now, Steve Bannon left the White House back in 2017. And in 2024, he served 4 months in federal custody after a jury found him guilty of contempt of Congress for ignoring that House Select Committee that was investigating January 6th, the insurrection. He ignored that subpoena. That subpoena wanted information, in part, about the Green Bay sweep, which was a plan that Bannon and other Trump lackeys orchestrated. And they were the architects, and it was basically to have people in Congress, specifically supporters of Donald Trump in Congress, be in opposition to the election results of the 2020 presidential election. Steve Bannon said, my defense is I was just following legal advice when I ignored that congressional subpoena, And I had invoked executive privilege to protect myself from being forced to have to answer questions by Congress pursuant to the subpoena. Well, that defense was rejected by a jury of his peers. He was found guilty and sentenced to 4 months. John Sauer, the Solicitor General of the United States, the guy who routinely goes in front of the Supreme Court and makes outrageous legal arguments on behalf of this administration, including the argument that he made in Trump versus U.S., which was the president of the United States could dispatch SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political opponent, and that would be okay because it was in, the ambit of a presidential duty. Solicitor General D. John Sauer told the Supreme Court, take Steve Bannon's appeal and send it back to that district court judge, Judge Nichols, so that he can dismiss the charges. Sauer wrote in his Supreme Court filing, quote, the government has determined in its prosecutorial discretion that dismissal of Bannon's criminal case is in the interest of justice. He also reminded the Supreme Court justices that prosecutors can actually dismiss charges even after a criminal defendant has proceeded to trial and a jury has found him guilty. This also is no coincidence and relating to the fact that the Department of Justice under Trump has also decided it will no longer defend the conviction of Peter Navarro, who also went to prison because he also defied a congressional subpoena from that select committee investigating January 6th. Navarro's appeal is still ongoing. So it sounds like, pretty obviously on its face, that the Trump DOJ and the Trump administration continues to do things for the benefit of Steve Bannon. Why? Steve Bannon has shown his open derision for Trump. And even though Steve Bannon has made his name and staked his claim on the back of Trump, some people would argue that Steve Bannon doesn't need Donald Trump. So really the question is, why does Donald Trump need Steve Bannon? Which gets me back to the beginning of this episode, which is Steve Bannon knows way more about Jeffrey Epstein than I think any average person whose name is appearing in the Epstein files would know. But don't just look at me. Let's talk about the film that Steve Bannon was filming in an effort to fix and repair Jeffrey Epstein's reputation. Steve Bannon says that he filmed 15 hours of interviews with Jeffrey Epstein. House Oversight last year got from the Epstein estate, pursuant to a subpoena that it served on the Epstein estate, communications within which Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein talk about Bannon filming Epstein and making sure that it's done in a way that will be a light most favorable for Jeffrey Epstein's reputation. And within those communications that were released by Epstein's estate, there was the mention of an agreement called a Kovell agreement, K-O-V-E-L. What is that? Well, let's start with going back to law school for a second here. When you have an attorney-client relationship, as many of you are aware, there is a presumption of confidentiality that exists because of the attorney-client privilege. The client, him or herself, holds that privilege, and only the client can waive that privilege, thereby waiving the confidentiality of the communications between the attorney and the client. But it makes sense that attorneys oftentimes would have to hire third parties that are experts in their own respective fields to provide assistance in cases and in the representation of that client. For example, I, as a trial lawyer, may hire an accountant if I have a case that involves some measure of complexities when it deals with maybe financial issues or maybe tax issues. Now, that accountant isn't a lawyer. There may be another privilege, and I don't want to get into that specifically, but the idea is this. I am hiring a third party. I, as the lawyer for the client, am hiring a third party who's an expert in a particular field. And my communications with that third party about the client should be and are shielded if there's an agreement called a Kovell agreement that is entered into, because I have to communicate with that third party to ensure that I am getting the facts portrayed and conveyed, accurately, and that I am getting the right type of assistance from this third party. Now, how do we get this linked back to Steve Bannon? Well, the communications released by the Epstein estate reveal that Steve Bannon was to be the subject of a Kovell agreement, that Darren Indyke, who is the longtime lawyer and is also a co-executor of Epstein's estate, Darren Indyke, as the lawyer, was going to retain Steve Bannon as an expert or as a third party who was then going to be protected by the attorney-client privilege. So then the communications between Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein will be held to be confidential, right? Now, look, y'all know Jeffrey Epstein is dead. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think there's something very suspicious about the way that Jeffrey Epstein died. But you know who holds that confidentiality privilege in that attorney-client relationship? Darren Indyke, as one of the executors of Epstein's estate. And we know Darren Indyke is going to appear next month in March before House Oversight for his deposition. So, House Oversight, if you're listening, and P.S., I am going to be talking to members of House Oversight, Democratic members of House Oversight in the next 24 to 48 hours, you need to ask Darren Indyke about Steve Bannon and this Kovell agreement, which nobody has seen, by the way, the actually signed agreement. Nobody has seen it. And we don't have confirmation one was actually entered into that Steve Bannon signed. All of that being said, it's still worth asking at a minimum to get Steve Bannon in front of a committee to answer questions. Now, Epstein, in emails with Bannon, said, look, what we could do is this. We could actually have you be the subject of a Kovell agreement. This is April 30th, 2019. Now remember, Jeffrey Epstein was indicted in July, on July 8th of 2019. April 30th, 2019. This is Jeffrey Epstein to Steve Bannon. I watched the interview. Well done again. Thanks. Here's what I think will work legally. Epstein goes on to say, I pay direct costs of filming. As Darren is the contractor for legal service prep, it gets paid by Darren. He has final control as it is his work product. I have no interest whatsoever in making money here. Zero. You, as in Steve Bannon, you deserve whatever it brings, as it is our cost, no return on it. To which Steve Bannon responds, are you far enough along in your assignment? Could we film this weekend? And the answer is K, as in okay. I ask K. Right? Now, efforts to film Jeffrey Epstein by Steve Bannon go as far back, at least from what I could find so far in my review of the Epstein files, as far back as 2018. Here's some text messages on May 9th, 2018. Jeffrey Epstein says, you coming back this week to film? Answer from Steve Bannon, yes, I think headed back in the morning. Epstein says, DC or New York? Steve Bannon says, DC. Got to report face-to-face to some people. Understood. Friday night Chomsky for dinner if you like. Travel safe. Chomsky being Noam Chomsky, the famed linguist and professor who Jeffrey Epstein knew and was chumming around with, and that Steve Bannon wanted to put in the film to legitimize Jeffrey Epstein. Bannon says, thanks. Here's another text message. This one's dated February 24th, 2019. Jeffrey Epstein to Steve Bannon. Dinner with Woody, as in Woody Allen, or too many pedos in one place? Do you think I can do my own video interview and upload it on YouTube? No sandbagging, interview format, or just a diary-like piece? Bannon responds on February 26, 2019. If you do an interview, it can't just be like Johnny does a YouTube. It has to be amazingly professional and perfectly cut. Epstein says, Woody, as in Allen, said he would help edit. Not sure how to stage, what points to make, but better than trying to do an interview that I have no experience doing. Goal to humanize the monster. Anything written carries little weight. Tomorrow, the juxtaposition of Michael Cohen testifying why Trump is with Kim, as in the president of North Korea, is wild. Bannon says yes. Jeffrey Epstein says, should it be an interview format? Interviewed by? Or just me? Speaking to the camera? Humor? Apology? How did I get rich? Topics? Later on, there's a picture sent by Jeffrey Epstein of Alex Acosta. in an accompanying New York Times article. Epstein says, one of the most important facts for the public seems to be the girls used the agreement to get money and only after then tried to have it voided. Who would write a pro-Acosta story, as in a pro-Alex Acosta? Remember, he was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida that failed and chose not to prosecute Jeffrey Epstein back in 2008, and then Epstein got his sweetheart plea deal from the state of Florida. Bannon, in response to the pro-Alex Acosta story. Now, Epstein says, the idea is to get into the public realm the story that the girls used the agreement to get money from them and their attorney for them and their attorneys, and only after receiving it, they move to overturn it. Plus, Trump had a bad day. Did you watch? Bannon said, how bad was it? Epstein says, bad, but Republicans stood strong. Cohen, as in Michael Cohen, was pretty detailed. Okay? So there's a plan to, quote, humanize the monster. And back on June 6th of 2019, the Kovell agreement is actually mentioned explicitly by and between Epstein and Bannon. I assume your guys are not filming on the island this weekend. I will be in town Tuesday to Thursday, then Paris. That's Jeffrey Epstein to Bannon. Bannon says, okay. Epstein, we need to talk about Kovell, letter and black bag. Bannon, as in a Kovell agreement regarding accounting and finance? Epstein, legal, privileged. Recall, smiley face emoji. Bannon, yes. Bannon later says, okay, we need a deal for the entire training, in quotes. Epstein, I'm aware, prep, of course. There are emails and text messages, between Bannon and Epstein wherein Bannon is actually offering his media team to help train Jeffrey Epstein to be prepared to be able to do the filming so he comes across in the most favorable way. So, in July of last year, Steve Bannon told a fan that he would release the Epstein documentary as a 5-part series early next year, as in early 2026. But so far, there has been no release. And the only time anybody's seen anything really was a trailer that was released by the New York Post back in 2021. Mark Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein's brother, said that Steve Bannon told him in a meeting after Jeffrey Epstein died that Mark Epstein couldn't see the footage of Jeffrey Epstein because it was, quote, witness preparation, thus the word prep, that's why I read that to you, and that it was protected under, quote, attorney-client confidentiality. Mark Epstein telling the publication Business Insider, quote, he, as in Bannon, said he had 16 hours of tapes. He said they were in his vault and that they were protected under attorney-client privilege. I don't know because he's not an attorney, but anyhow, that's what he told me. Remember how I said how Bannon was being used to fix Epstein's reputation? Bannon is the one who said, this documentary should focus on the narrative of redemption. Bannon says, we must counter the narrative that Jeffrey Epstein is a, quote, rapist who traffics in female children to be raped by the world's most powerful, richest men. Bannon says, that can't be redeemed. Bannon, in another text to Epstein, says, you can't redeem unredeemable. You, as in Jeffrey Epstein, are a lot of things which we will show, but you are not that. Now, Darren Indyke would have been the person as the lawyer for Jeffrey Epstein. Indyke would have had to hire Steve Bannon under this Kovell agreement framework and structure. Darren Indyke's going to have to answer questions about that when he testifies before us House Oversight. Because I underscore for you the importance of these conversations and the importance of getting information from Steve Bannon. Remember, Jeffrey Epstein indicted on July 8th, 2019. July 6, 2019, Steve Bannon texting Jeffrey Epstein. Can we film Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon? Epstein, goofball, had you told me earlier, I would have adjusted my schedule. I'm only in town Sunday. If we can arrange it, can we film on the island, as in Epstein's pedo island? Answer from Epstein, yes. Bannon, perfect. Can we do late morning, say 11 a.m.? Look, 2 days before Jeffrey Epstein is indicted by the Southern District of New York, Steve Bannon is planning filming on the island of Jeffrey Epstein, the place where a lot of the trafficking and sex abuse of little girls happened. How can you tell me with a straight face, anyone in this administration or the Trump DOJ, that Steve Bannon doesn't know information substantively and of value about Jeffrey Epstein? Don't you think somebody should be asking if Steve Bannon is a co-conspirator of Jeffrey Epstein? I mean, why would I say that? Well, here's a text message by and between Epstein and Bannon from April 3rd of 2019. Steve Bannon laughed my ass off. LMAO, Bolsonaro, as in the Brazilian guy, head, the anti-corruption guy, though. Epstein says, you can structure the message, me, the massage. Steve Bannon, see where that got us. Epstein responds, LOL, Woody Allen, pedophile, right? Coming to dinner tonight if you like. Steve Bannon says, in D.C. These are the messages. These are the words of Steve Bannon. There's a reason why the focus, the spotlight, should be squarely on Steve Bannon. Folks, I got more, but we're going to leave it now for this particular episode here at the Katie Phang News channel. Be mad, be outraged, demand accountability, including Steve Bannon being forced to have to answer questions in front of a congressional committee about what he knew about Jeffrey Epstein. And let's look at that footage. Look, is it self-serving? I'm sure it is, right? Bannon was hired to be able to do a fluff piece. Bannon was the fluffer for Jeffrey Epstein to fix his reputation, right? But we should see it, shouldn't we? And if Bannon is claiming attorney-client privilege, then we should find out if Darren Indyke hired Steve Bannon pursuant to a Kovell agreement to do that. I'll catch you on the other side. Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.